Intel's new i7-9700K is available for about $400 to $430, which lands it between the 9900K, priced at around $550 on a good day, and the 8700K's $370 price point. We got ours on a bit of the high side of the curve, but you can get them as low as $400 on Newegg, for example, these days. And we were looking to test the new 8-core, 8-thread CPU versus the not that old 8700K and the hyperthreaded 9900K of a similar spec. Intel made a big move away from 4-core 8-thread CPUs and the incumbent pricing structure, with the 9700K acting as the first K-SKU i7 in a while anyway to lack hyperthreading. Before that, this video is brought to you by us and the GN Store. One of the best ways to support us and get something in return is to grab an item from the GN Store, like one of our blue beer glasses with a gold halo featuring the popular Teardown logo, or one of our critically acclaimed mod mats with wiring diagrams and a GPU teardown grid. We also have a brand new black and blue mousepad that many of you requested, now available on the store. We keep selling out of things thanks to you all, but we've been working hard to get it back in stock. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab something today. The 9700K is a weird one, because if you look at it, first instinct is kind of, wait a minute, they just turned off hyperthreading? So what's the deal? Because that's what happened. It's okay to have product segmentation. We've talked about that in the past. These types of architectures can cost billions of dollars to make if you look at something like NVIDIA's newest architectures, for example. And in order to get any return on that ever, you do have to segment it. So we can understand and respect that to a certain degree. Now, what's harder for people to really understand and accept is, do you just flip a toggle to turn off hyperthreading, or what's going on? Because you've got a 9900K for $150 more, and it's more or less the same product as the 9700K, just there's some numbers changes, nothing major. Still the same silicon ultimately. And then really the big difference is there's no hyperthreading. So you end up without SMT. And so that gives you an 8-core, 8-thread part, whereas basically every previous i7 was 4 cores, 8 threads. So in terms of pure thread count, you end up about the same. Core count obviously goes up, but that doesn't really necessarily mean anything depending on what kind of workload you have. And price goes up, which makes it feel kind of funny to buy a 9700K if you're used to buying the previous i7s where it's more in the $340 range. And I mean, it was the best other than HEDT. So the stack has completely shifted now. Now you have functionally a low-end HEDT CPU in the desktop market, the 9900K. And you have the 9700K dropping a core feature of the i7s, but instead adding more physical cores. So I guess the question then is it a lateral move, or worse, is it a downgrade from the 8700K where you had 6 cores, 12 threads? So you have more threads, and that is one that a test in Blender would be great to illustrate, something we have in these results today, because in Blender you can really start looking at thread impact to performance, where having more cores doesn't necessarily mean everything. Sometimes just having threads, even if it's just sort of pseudo threads through SMT, that helps a lot. So that's something we'll be looking at today with the 9700K versus the 8700K. And then of course we also have overclock numbers in there as well. We only pushed ours to 5.1 gigahertz. We did have trouble with this particular CPU. So our 9900K did pretty well once we had it delidded, liquid metal, and under a big water loop. It was doing something like 5.3 gigahertz. Actually, we hit 5.4 briefly. So that one did pretty well for us. The 9700K, we were hoping it would supersede the performance of the 9900K, because having fewer things and having fewer threads means you're dealing with less heat in a concentrated area, so it should theoretically overclock better. The problem is that you're still relying on silicon binning at the end of the day, so if you don't win the silicon lottery, well, there's nothing you can do about it. So other than go crazier, we could deal with this one and put it under chilled water, and then it would do pretty okay. But let's go through the benchmarks for games through Blender, and then we also have some thermal testing in here as well, comparing versus the 9900K, both stock and delidded, to give you an idea of what kind of cooler you might need to deal with this CPU. F1 2018 produces extremely high frame rates, something not commonly found in other titles. This game becomes CPU bound rapidly, as our RTX 2080 Ti allows all of these CPUs to fully stretch their legs, as best illustrated by the 7980XE at 4.6 GHz hitting 307 FPS average. It's a bit high. The point is that the bottleneck in here is elevated enough to really look at performance differences with CPUs, to a point where it may become sort of almost useless at this type of frame rate, but we're still going to look at it. The i7-9700K stock ends up at 273 FPS average, putting it functionally tied with the 9600K at 5.2 GHz, but ahead of the stock 9600K by about 6.2%. The stock 9900K operates less meaningfully ahead of the stock 9700K with limited gains of about 3.3%. Overclocking the 9700K pushes it to roughly stock 9900K performance levels. Compared to the 8700K, the stock i7-9700K ends up at about 10% ahead in average frame rate, although overclocking gets the 8700K to nearing equivalence when at 5.0 GHz. For anyone moving off of something like an i7-2600K or a 4790K, and we'll highlight those CPUs for you, you're looking at noteworthy performance improvements, even when considering a 2600K overclocked heavily. Ryzen remains confined to the lower half or so of the chart as a result of the lower frequency, and this game does seem primarily bound by Amdahl's law. Here's a frame time chart for F1 2018 at 1080p, showing the 9700K 5.1 GHz CPU, 8700K 5.0 GHz stock CPU, and R7 2700 at 4.2 GHz, functionally a 2700X, or close enough to it. As a reminder, frame time plots show individual frames over time, providing the truest representation of how long it took to render each frame. We're looking at frame-to-frame intervals on the y-axis, labeled in milliseconds time to render, with frame number on the x-axis. Lower is better, but more consistent is better than strictly lower. The 9700K manages to be both lowest and most consistent, making it the most fluid courier of frames in this test. Average frame-to-frame interval is about 4 milliseconds for the 9700K, with the 8700K at about 4.2 milliseconds. The 2700 at 4.2 GHz competes reasonably and averages about 5.3 to 5.7 millisecond frame times. All three tests encounter spikes upwards of 16 to 20 milliseconds, but none of them are jarring to a point of ruining the experience. They are noticeable, though, and most humans tend to notice about an 8 to 12 millisecond delta frame to frame. As for 1440p results, the top-end results are truncated by the GPU limitations imposed by a higher resolution, maxing out the ceiling at 240 FPS average. The 9700K ends up ranked alongside the 9900K and 7980XE. That's because we're now hitting a bottleneck with the RTX 2080 Ti, resultant of resolution increase to 1440p. If you're playing at high resolutions and commonly GPU bound, this chart illustrates the performance falloff from becoming limited by another component. Lower-end devices end up performing about the same, as they're slower than the GPU, and so not limited. Assassin's Creed Origins at 1080p medium stands as our next benchmark. Assassin's Creed uniquely makes use of both additional threads and additional frequency, whereas most games lean entirely on frequency. This is made obvious by our 7980XE at 4.6 GHz outperforming CPUs like the 9700K at 5.1 GHz, a significant frequency delta, but also a significant core delta, and you can kind of do the math there. The 9700K stock CPU ends up at 127 FPS average, marginally better than the 8700K at 5 GHz. There's about a 12% uplift over the stock 8700K, a noteworthy gain, and this comes down to stock frequency increases in the 9700K. For reference, the Intel i7-2600K at 4.7 GHz does about 76 FPS average, and the AMD R7-2700 at 4.2 GHz does about 104 FPS average, right around where the 7700K is, so that marks most tiers of the chart for you. Far Cry 5 positions the i7-9700K at 149 FPS average, right behind the 9600K at 5.2 GHz. Note that Far Cry has also had routine issues with frame times and i5 CPUs, something we are actively researching now that we have our 9700K in hand. That said, what we can learn is that the game benefits from higher frequencies in a direct fashion. It's just that it also benefits from having 8 threads. The 9700K ends up running at 159 FPS average when clocked to 5.1 GHz, putting it between the two 9900K SKUs on our chart. The 8700K stock CPU ends up at 141 FPS average, which plants it below the 9700K, but not by a meaningful amount. No one can reasonably detect the average frame time difference of 0.4 milliseconds between these two devices, and consistency is about the same for each, so that's good. The 2700 at 4.2 GHz ends up at around 111 FPS average, which is within error margins of the 2600 at the same frequency. These two AMD results illustrate a frequency and IPC limitation, not a thread limitation. Plotted instead as frame times, we can look at the 9700K, 8700K, and 9900K stock performance. The 9700K ends up fairly consistent, with a few spikes, 20 milliseconds and 16 milliseconds throughout testing. It's not bad overall, and we'd have to run a lot more passes here to determine how much those spikes are within the usual error margins. The 8700K stock CPUs end up similar to the 9700K in average frame time, but ultimately fall behind in the total frame throughput. The 8700K runs slower on average, if comparable, with the 9900K significantly more consistent, almost to a point of creating sort of a heart rate interval. It's very consistent at the beginning there. We've also plotted the 2700 at 4.2 GHz for reference, giving a test comparable to the 2700X. The 2700 at 4.2 GHz falls behind in both frame time and total frame throughput. It's still over 60 FPS, which would be around the 16.67 millisecond line on the y-axis, and it is overall consistent in frame delivery, much like the 9900K and 8700K. It's just a little bit slower, but still consistent. Unsurprisingly, we see mostly the same ranking order at 1440p. We're truncated at the top end by the GPU, which puts a cap on maximum performance. In this instance, the 8700K, 9700K, and 9900K are all rough equals. The 2700 still ends up at around 111 FPS average when overclocked, which is what you'd expect because we're capped by the CPU for the 2700, not by the GPU, which is what we see at the top end of the chart. Civilization 6 provides an important look at turn time performance rather than frame rate performance, instead testing grand campaign AI turn completion times. As an example, with 5 AI players that each take 10 seconds to process a turn, if you've never played this type of game before, you would be waiting 50 seconds before you are allowed to make your next play, which can be frustrating or get old as the turn times drag on. For our chart, the 9700K at 5.1 GHz ends up within margin of error of the 9900K at 5.2 GHz. We were unable to produce meaningfully different results between these two, and test variance puts them as functionally equivalent. That's good for the 9700K, although Civilization 6 has never been particularly thread intensive to begin with. This is best illustrated by looking at the stock R5 2600 versus the stock R7 2700, where you see the 2600 outperforming the 2700 by a slim margin. That's because of the higher stock frequencies and shows that the extra threads there really don't help in Civilization 6, illustrating what type of game Civilization 6 is. The stock 9700K ends up at 11.7 seconds per turn, with the stock 9900K again tied with the 9700K. The 8700K at 5 GHz ends up at 11.8 seconds, also functionally the same, although the stock 8700K ends up outside of error at 12.5 seconds per turn. Blender gives us a look at rendering performance for a tile-based production 3D rendering workload. This is very different from how something like Premiere would handle encoding, so we'd advise definitely not trying to extrapolate this performance to video production applications. For Blender, the 9700K at 5.1 GHz ends up completing the GN monkey head render in 25 minutes, or the GN logo render in 28 minutes. This places it around where the stock 2700 is, but with significantly higher power consumption at 16.5 amps, or about 198 watts, sometimes 195, depending on when you check the test. Overclocking the 2700 to 4.2 GHz, similar to where a 2700X would land, puts it at 23 minutes for the monkey heads and 27 minutes for the logo. This is where Ryzen starts to pull ahead, and is also where the 9900K shows its performance advantage over the 9700K because of that thread difference. The same is true for the 8700K, which leverages its extra threads on the 6-core, 12-thread approach to lead the 9700K in each test, both stock and overclocked. This illustrates that it's not all just about physical cores. 8 cores is beaten by 6 cores, 12 threads on the same processor family. It's still an Intel i7 family, so architecture is not really a big factor here. Thermals on the Intel i7-9700K are on the screen now. For auto settings, keep in mind that we heavily rely upon the motherboard used, as the temperature is most directly impacted by auto voltages. We're using the Asus Maximus 11 Hero for this one with MCE disabled. For the Maximus 11 Hero, those auto settings put the 9700K at 27 degrees Celsius over ambient when loaded to 100% with a Blender workload. And as a reminder, that's over ambient. If you're new here, that's not the direct temperature reading. Keep in mind that this is with MCE disabled, so it's following the boost duration specification set by Intel and sticking to a power consumption of 90 watts. Liquid temperature is at around 6 degrees over ambient during this test pass, and for power consumption, it starts out at about 9.5 amps and then drops to 7.5 amps, which would put you at 90 watts. Going to about 5 gigahertz and 1.35 volts, 5.1 gigahertz on the 9700K, we measure an average all-core load of 54 degrees over ambient with power consumption at about 188 watts and liquid thermals at about 10 degrees over ambient. This places the 9700K as noticeably cooler than our 9900K sample when soldered, which measured at 64 degrees over ambient, and that's with the solder. The thermal delta isn't for any reason other than the 9900K drawing significantly more power in this test. The two results are not directly comparable, other than to say that the 9700K's lack of hyperthreading does make it easier to keep cool, especially under heavier overclocks by drawing less power. This isn't a like-for-like comparison, given that power draw is different for each test, but that's not really what we're comparing. The 8086K is also not directly comparable in that its die is a completely different size, and so its dissipative properties are different than the 9700K and 9900K. That said, it's still accurate just with regard to comparing how your temperatures might vary from product to product or for purposes of selecting a new cooler or upgrading an existing one. Thermally, the 9700K isn't that hard to cool under auto conditions and can be kept reasonably cool with our X62 280 CLC even under overclocked conditions, although this is a somewhat conservative overclock. It does become a challenge to overclock beyond 5.1 gigahertz and 1.35 to 1.4 volts with this cooler as we're entering the 90s for some of the individual core temperatures. Not all of them, but as long as a couple are in the 90s and approaching TJ max, those will hold back our maximum overclock, which comes back to our 9980XE content where we show the core-to-core delta. So for those instances, you would need to upgrade the cooler, but some of this is also a silicon binning instance as well, because you might be able to drive a lower voltage than we needed for ours. That's all the data then. Not really a huge move from the 8700K. In some areas it's lateral, in some areas like Blender, it's a bit down actually because of the reduction in threads despite other improvements. And overall it just feels like kind of a wash. It's not a huge change. And like most CPU releases, if you had the most current previous generation from the same company, probably not a whole lot of point in upgrading. And that remains true today. The real question is there a point, at what point is there a reason to upgrade? So we have data for a 2600K in there. Probably a good time to upgrade from that one. It's still doing really well. It's holding on. 4.7 gigahertz overclock. You're doing all right. But it's definitely getting long in the tooth. So if you're on something like that, then your considerations are something like in the same price category, roughly. Really, it's an 8700K or a 9700K, with the 8700K being potentially cheaper in some non-US regions especially. And let us know what your regional pricing is, but depending on where you look, we've seen the 8700K on average is a bit cheaper, and that's true in the US too. It's just that for $30 cheaper, buying something older, you feel kind of bad. Like, should I just spend the extra $30 and get the new one? But if the performance is roughly the same, it's not like a GPU where driver support's really a concern over time. It's just, I mean, the performance is what it is. And it's not really going to change all that much. Things like Spectre and Meltdown notwithstanding. So should you buy the 9700K? Well, the 9900K is kind of out of this conversation because it's just so much more expensive. The 8700K is a bit advantaged in Blender, but that's about it. So for an extra couple bucks, if you really care about that reduction in frame times, then yes, the 9700K is better. If you want something like just Blender performance, you're not on a recent Intel or AMD CPU and you're building a new computer for the first time in a few years, and you're looking for 3D rendering and application performance in something like Blender, then consider strongly Ryzen as a much cheaper alternative for something like a 2700 and then overclock it in 15 minutes or less, and you functionally have a 2700X that outperforms most, but not all, of the new Intel CPUs for a price reduction in that application, and something like Blender rendering. Not necessarily true for encoding in Premiere, where Intel and QuickSync do have a bit of an advantage there that AMD does not presently have, and that's discussion for another time. But overall, the 9700K is hard to come to a firm conclusion on because it's just such a weird part. It doesn't really feel great to buy something where, you know, they just turned off hyperthreading and previously it was on, but also they're more physical cores. So kind of at a net zero for thread count increase, which is boring, and the frequency goes up a couple hundred megahertz, which is boring. So hard to say, but not exciting enough to run out and buy. If you're building a computer anyway, don't feel bad about it. It's just that, yeah, the price creeps up a bit. So you've got alternatives if you don't like that. That's it for this one. Subscribe for more as always. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, or go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to pick up a shirt like this one. Or we just got the dark mouse pads in, so it's a black-blue combination if you've been waiting for one of those. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.